You know, we often think of history as something written in these grand official documents, but sometimes the most incredible truths are hiding in the most ordinary places. Like, say, a 49-cent notebook that just sat in an archive, untouched for decades. This is the story of how that one simple diary completely rewrote the history of a presidency.
So this notebook, right? It belonged to a man named Arthur Burns, one of President Richard Nixon's most powerful advisors. And for 6 incredibly tumultuous years, from 1969 to 1974, he secretly wrote down everything he was thinking. It's this completely unfiltered, behind-the-scenes look at a presidency that was, as we now know, about to come completely unraveled.
And believe it or not, this whole story starts with just immense hope. This is a quote from just 2 days after Nixon's inauguration. Burns is watching his new boss, and he is just filled with confidence. He truly believed he was looking at a leader who was perfectly prepared for the job, a man who'd spent his whole life training for this exact moment.
So this really was the promise of a whole new era. And that initial optimism from Burns, it wasn't just him. It totally captured the mood of a nation that was just exhausted by division and desperately wanted a leader who could heal the wounds of the past.
I mean, you have to remember, after the political and social storms of the 1960s, this simple phrase, "bring us together," was exactly what so many Americans, Arthur Burns included, wanted to hear. They genuinely thought Nixon could be the guy to do it. The problem was, as Burns was about to find out, the man behind closed doors was not the man the public saw at all.
Because, well, it didn't take long for that initial admiration to start to curdle into some pretty deep concern. Burns's diary becomes this incredible record of him slowly realizing that the man in the Oval Office was not the man he thought he knew.
And we're not talking about just some vague feelings here. The diary is full of specific, troubling patterns. He writes about Nixon's worrisome behavior and even these episodes of insane shouting. He saw a president who needed constant drama, who would perform these grand, almost theatrical acts just to convince himself that he was a strong leader.
And this, right here, this is the core of his whole analysis. Burns, who's an economist, mind you, basically becomes an amateur psychologist. He diagnoses the president with a dogged inferiority complex. He could see that underneath all that political bravado was this deep, gnawing insecurity, a fatal flaw that was about to have profound consequences for everyone.
So you can probably guess what happened next. That deep insecurity started to play out in a very public and very damaging arena, the nation's economy. And this wasn't just a simple policy debate. It was a fundamental clash, a battle of wills between two powerful men with completely different goals. Okay, so the conflict was actually pretty simple when you boil it down. Nixon wanted economic policies that would help him win re-election, period. And he was absolutely willing to pressure the Federal Reserve to make that happen. But Burns, who would later become chairman of the Fed, was just horrified by this. He fought tooth and nail to protect the bank's independence, arguing for long-term stability over short-term political points.
And in the end, Nixon won. He pushed through policies like closing the gold window, which basically meant the US dollar wasn't backed by a fixed amount of gold anymore. Burns knew this was a huge gamble, and he was right. These very decisions helped create the economic disaster of the 1970s we call stagflation, that awful mix of crazy high inflation and high unemployment.
But, you know, Burns's diary wasn't just about Nixon. It was also this brutally honest and often scathing portrait of the president's entire inner circle. I mean, from the most famous cabinet members to the closest aides, he held nothing back.
So, let's start with a big one. Henry Kissinger, the legendary Secretary of State. Burns totally respected his political genius, but he was completely unimpressed with his grasp of economics, calling him admittedly ignorant on the whole subject.
And then you've got John Connally, the Treasury Secretary. Burns didn't see him as some powerful Texas dealmaker. Nope, he just saw a thoroughly confused politician.
Okay, but what about Nixon's real inner circle, his gatekeepers, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman? Well, Burns dismissed them with the single devastating word, vulgarians. He believed they were the only people the president actually felt comfortable around, which tells you a lot about the atmosphere inside that White House.
So let's put some faces to these names. Here they are. This is the inner circle. The brilliant but ignorant analyst, the confused politician, the vulgarian gatekeepers. These were the men Burns was dealing with every single day. The people he was watching with such a critical eye as the whole administration started to crumble from the inside out.
You can just feel it as you read through the diary. As the years went on, the entries just get darker and darker. That initial hope is long gone. He started to see all these individual character flaws, not as separate issues, but as symptoms of a much deeper sickness that was infecting the entire White House.
The editor of the diary really hits the nail on the head when he summarizes Burns's growing despair. He saw the administration's actions, on everything from economics to politics, as following a sick approach. It was this paranoid, extreme mindset that, as the quote says, only made sense in a feverish way.
And right there, that's the big reveal of this whole diary. That desperate need for control, that willingness to bend any rule for political gain that Burns first saw in those economic debates, it was the exact same mindset that led directly to the Watergate scandal. The private, worrisome behavior he'd been documenting in that cheap notebook had now exploded into a public catastrophe that would bring down an entire presidency.
Really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Arthur Burns's secret diary completely changes how we see one of the most documented presidencies in all of American history. So if that's the case, what other truths are still out there, just lying hidden in an attic or some dusty archive, waiting for their moment to change everything we think we know?